Hi everyone, my name is Misiura, and today I'm going to be talking to you about racial disparities in Alzheimer's and vascular disease. I just want to give you a little bit of background. I actually have a firsthand account of vascular dementia. My grandfather was diagnosed with dementia, and they weren't really sure whether it was Alzheimer's disease or something else, and he recently passed away from kidney disease. But one thing that really was difficult for me to watch was the struggle of my grandma figuring out how to get care for him, what his diagnosis actually was, what lifestyle factors could contribute to his dementia. And so hopefully I may provide some small sense of insight for some of you watching this talk that can be able to advocate and also make informed decisions about your care and participating in scientific research in the future. So as Liz mentioned, my research areas are in dementia and disparities, as well as vascular influences of development of Alzheimer's disease. I use neuroimaging as my primary methodology for studying vascular disease as well as dementia, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Georgia State University in the Dotson lab. So this is kind of an overview of what I'm going to be talking about tonight. I have this question up here, healthy heart, healthy brain, because although the answer is yes, if you have a healthy heart, then you're more likely to have a healthy brain, there are still a lot of unanswered facets to that question, and that's kind of what I'm going to be covering in my talk. So the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to start by talking about what Alzheimer's disease looks like in the brain and also in behavior. What is race and how do we define race when we're talking about Alzheimer's disease? What does vascular disease look like in the brain and how does it present itself behaviorally? And then how are race, vascular disease, and Alzheimer's disease related? And then lastly, I'm going to talk about how diversity factors into these questions and what you can do to help answer some of these questions. So first, I want to start with what is Alzheimer's disease? Alzheimer's disease is actually the most common type of dementia, and dementia is actually just an umbrella term that describes a wide variety of cognitive impairment diseases. So these are most often diseases associated with aging, such as Alzheimer's disease, but there's a number of different dementias, frontotemporal dementia, dementia with Lewy bodies. So Alzheimer's disease is just a type of dementia, and many people use these terms interchangeably, but I just want everyone to walk away from this talk understanding that dementia is just an umbrella term of which Alzheimer's disease is a type of dementia. So in the brain, Alzheimer's disease is characterized by these plaques, which are associated with amyloid, and tangles, which are associated with tau. I'm not really going to go a lot into the neuropathology of these particular facets of the disease, but I just want everyone to, when they hear the word plaque, I would like for them to be able to associate it with amyloid, and when they hear the word tangle, I want them to associate it with tau, because I'm also going to bring up tau a little bit later in my presentation. Alzheimer's disease, from a neuroimaging perspective, is characterized by an atrophy in memory areas of the brain. And if you know the area that's associated with memory, I'm going to check the chat, and maybe some of you actually know the region of the brain that is associated with memory, and I will be able to tell you later. I just want to give you guys some time to see what you already know about the brain. And then Alzheimer's disease is also associated with cognitive symptoms, in particular memory loss. So the reason that I have this picture up here of this older woman and this man is because this is actually like the Google picture. When you search Alzheimer's disease, this is the picture that comes up. And so everyone that knows about Alzheimer's disease is pretty familiar with the fact that it's associated with memory loss. It's diagnosed using cognitive tests such as like memory tests and like tests of visual spatial function, just to kind of rule out any other dementias, as well as using neuroimaging, so using MRI and PET scans, and then doctor-patient interviews. So an interview with your neurologist to see, okay, what kind of cognitive impairment are you actually experiencing? And the one thing that's really important to know is that you actually can't get diagnosed definitively with Alzheimer's disease until you pass away and they look at your brain under the microscope. So being able to improve our diagnostic methods of saying, yes, you actually have Alzheimer's disease is obviously very important, because I'm going to talk about some problems associated with misdiagnosis a little bit later. So first, before I go on, I would like to define race. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk a lot about race, but we need to actually understand what it is from a scientific perspective and also how I'm going to use it in my particular area of research. So this is a figure actually taken from a Nature paper that shows first and foremost, that genetic race has little biological support. So scientists have tried to kind of pin down what race is from a genetic standpoint. And what we can see in this picture is that you have these two Caucasian men and then an Asian man. And if we look at the genes of the parents of all of these men, and then you look at the genes of the children, so the men themselves, there's actually more overlap, as you can see in this Venn diagram, between the Asian man and the two Caucasian men, rather than there is between the two Caucasian men. So the Asian man is more genetically similar to these two white men than the two white men are to each other. And furthermore, from a dementia perspective, risk factors for dementia are different. And before I go on, I just want to say that this is an example. Obviously, this wouldn't be the case across everyone, but this is an example of how genetic race can sometimes be an imperfect measure of what we're actually trying to study. So from a dementia and an African American perspective, risk factors for dementia are actually different between Black Americans and Africans. So they've done a lot of research looking at the genetic profiles in a particular facet of people called the Yoruba people from Nigeria, and then obviously in African Americans. And there are different genetic risk factors in each of those populations, further indicating that genetic race is an imperfect measure of how that can relate to dementia. So why should we study it if it's an imperfect measure? Well, the way that we talk about race in my particular area of research is it's defined as an ethnocultural group. So this is ancestry, so the particular genes that might be associated with your ancestry as well as your lifestyle. And this is really important in studying disparities in dementia because African Americans are 2 times as likely to develop Alzheimer's disease in their lifetime than Caucasians. So this is a really important takeaway that even though genetic race is imperfect, just someone saying, yes, I am an African American or yes, I'm Caucasian, those measures are good enough to identify this huge disparity such that African Americans are twice as likely to develop dementia in their lifetime or Alzheimer's disease in their lifetime. There are also a variety of cognitive differences. So remember I talked earlier about the memory impairment associated with Alzheimer's disease, but there are groups of people within that get diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease that actually don't have memory complaints. They have complaints in maybe visual spatial function or motor or executive function, which is your ability to kind of control your cognitive processes. So these are what we call non-amnestic or non-memory impaired individuals. And 18%, estimates as high as 18% of African Americans experience this non-amnestic form of dementia or form of Alzheimer's disease, whereas 12% of Caucasians or non-Hispanic whites experience this non-amnestic form. So cognitive deficits outside of memory are higher in African Americans. African Americans also exhibit a slower decline in Alzheimer's disease. So once you're diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, your trajectory and your impairment is actually a little bit slower if you're African American. And there are also different levels of tau. So remember, I talked about earlier that tau is this protein that's associated with Alzheimer's disease. You have to have both amyloid and tau present in your brain when you pass away for definitive diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. And what we've seen is that African Americans actually have different levels of tau in their cerebrospinal fluid than Caucasians. So African Americans generally actually have lower levels of tau at the same symptom level and the same amyloid level than non-Hispanic whites. So understanding why that is something, these findings are actually relatively new within, I would say, the tau findings within the last 2 or 3 years. And so understanding exactly why that is going to be obviously really important for care as well as understanding cutoffs, developing cutoffs for Alzheimer's disease. There are also a variety of structural and functional differences in the brain, and I'm actually going to go through the different methods that we use to characterize Alzheimer's disease from a neuroimaging perspective, and I'm going to go a little bit more in depth about this. And African Americans are also more likely to have vascular disease. So 42% of African American adults over the age of 25 report having vascular disease versus 26.5% of adults that are Caucasian report having vascular disease. And this is really important because, as I'm going to talk about later, vascular disease and Alzheimer's disease are highly interconnected. Okay, so more for a like educational, also just from a personal interest perspective, and because I'm trying to be a good steward of the neuroimaging field, I'm going to just briefly go over some ways that we use to characterize Alzheimer's disease within the neuroimaging community. So the first way is through a PET scan, or a positron emission tomography. Most people know this as a PET scan, and this has gotten a lot of kind of hype recently with the different controversies associated with this new drug aducanumab, which is they used PET scans to determine the effectiveness of this drug. So most often in Alzheimer's disease, they give you a scan looking for amyloid, and they attach this radioactive tracer that would bind to the amyloid molecules in your brain. And so then they would give you a PET scan to be able to tell you where the amyloid is located in your brain. So we can see that this person that has a negative scan, they don't have very much amyloid. It's kind of centered around particular regions of the brain. And then this positive scan, this person has widely distributed amyloid. And in normal aging, there are elevated levels of amyloid and tau, but it's a particular type of amyloid and a particular type of tau that meets the diagnostic criteria for Alzheimer's disease. And so that's what this PET scan is looking for. And there are tau PET scans as well. They're just relatively new and not used as widely in actual doctor's offices yet. Okay, so here with the next couple of methods, this is using magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI. Here's where we start to see some of these racial disparities appear. So an MRI uses, functional MRI measures brain activity. And there are particular regions that are associated with Alzheimer's disease where this brain activity is lower, or the relationship between regions of the brain and the relationship between activity in particular regions of the brain is lower in Alzheimer's disease. And this has kind of been a widely accepted finding within Alzheimer's disease research. But some of my recent research that considers race as a variable of interest in my studies, I have found that this kind of overarching categorization of lower activity or lower functional correlation in Alzheimer's disease is actually not necessarily applicable to African Americans. And so if we want to try to use some of these methods as diagnostic and study models of looking at trajectory of Alzheimer's disease, having really accurate and generalizable models is crucial. And I actually included a link that that's going to be posted into the chat to my paper if you're actually interested in reading at least the abstract, unless you're a really big science nerd and you want to read the actual paper itself that talks about some of these functional MRI differences between Caucasians and non-Hispanic whites. Or sorry, African Americans and Caucasians or non-Hispanic whites. Okay, so this facet of Alzheimer's disease diagnosis I find to be really interesting. So structural MRI is kind of the gold standard of using neuroimaging of MRI in Alzheimer's disease, because I didn't mention this earlier, but with a PET scan, you can still be amyloid positive but not have symptoms, and then you wouldn't get a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. It's really the marriage of your symptoms with the amyloid positive scan that would suggest that you have Alzheimer's disease. But on a structural MRI, you can get a little bit more specific as to what regions of the brain are actually dying off as a result of the disease. So a structural MRI just looks at how big structures are in the brain, what do they actually look like. If you've ever gotten an MRI, to see if you have a herniated disc or to look at, some type of torn ligament, you likely got a structural MRI. And atrophy in memory regions is a sign of Alzheimer's disease. So the memory region that I didn't mention earlier is actually the hippocampus. So these green circles are circling the hippocampus, and the hippocampus is responsible. It's kind of the primary structure in the brain that's associated with memory. And so atrophy or cell death in the hippocampus is associated with memory loss. But this may not necessarily be the case for African Americans. So this top scan is a scan of an individual who is Caucasian and has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And as you can see in this green circle, there's a lot of this kind of black area that really shouldn't be black. This should all be gray. And that gray stuff is gray matter that makes up the hippocampus. But what we can see in this lower scan is this is also an individual who's been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, but they are African American. And if we can look at their hippocampus, it's a lot more well preserved and a lot more intact than the Caucasian individual above. So if we're using hippocampal atrophy as a measure of Alzheimer's disease, and yet both of these people were diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, there's something that needs to change in our models if we want to have an accurate diagnosis, or if we want to use MRI to accurately diagnose Alzheimer's disease. So now I'm going to venture off a little bit and talk about vascular disease. So I'm going to come back to why we should study diversity and how this plays out, but I want to also bring in a vascular piece of this because I think it's really important just in general population to understand the relationships between vascular disease and Alzheimer's disease, because vascular disease, there are modifiable things that you can do to help improve your vascular system. I'm not going to really go into those tonight. I'm just going to introduce the relationship between the two diseases. So vascular disease is generally described as any abnormal condition of the blood vessels, but this is obviously a very broad term, and it doesn't really provide a lot of the specificity that we would need if we were going to do a study looking at vascular disease and Alzheimer's disease. But it places a huge burden globally. So in 2015, 263 million people reported to be living with vascular disease. And there's also an increased prevalence of vascular disease in African Americans. So remember, I talked about 40 to 42% a prevalence of vascular disease in African Americans versus 26.5% of vascular disease, or of Caucasian individuals have vascular disease. It's also a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. So if you have vascular disease, you are more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. And it's associated with inflammation. So this is this kind of new concept of inflammaging, which is a really hot topic right now, and something that some of the researchers that I work with have been contributing a lot to that piece of literature, is that there are these inflammatory processes that go on in your body when you have these types of diseases that may actually, one disease may actually lead to another. So the inflammation associated with vascular disease could contribute to Alzheimer's disease down the road. But vascular disease is related to both lifestyle and genetic risk factors. And we talked about what's another way to talk about lifestyle and genetic risk factors. Well, it's race or ethnocultural group. And these are likely synergistic in that lifestyle can, if you have a particular genetic predisposition for something, but you have these modifiable lifestyle factors, well, if you change your lifestyle, you may be able to kind of mitigate some of those genetic risk factors. Whereas if you were genetically predisposed and you engage in, poor lifestyle choices, you may actually exacerbate some of the genetic risk factors that you have. And there's another piece of this called vascular dementia. So vascular disease can actually lead to vascular dementia, and I'm going to talk about what that is in just a second. Okay, so just as I was talking earlier about how we look at Alzheimer's disease in the brain, there is actually a way to look at vascular disease in the brain. There are a variety of methods for doing this, but the one that I'm going to talk about is one that I actually use. So these are called white matter hyperintensities. So this is a particular type of a scan called a FLAIR scan. And the name might sound kind of complicated, white matter hyperintensity. It sounds like very medical or sciencey, but actually the name says it all. It's just in a region that appears to be hyper intense on a particular type of scan. So the whole brain really should be this kind of grayish color. And we can see these spots that I've kind of highlighted in these with these pink arrows. There's two kind of blotches, as well as these that I didn't highlight in this brain on the left. And then in the right brain, you can see that there's a lot of this kind of bleeding over of the white matter hyperintensities into the rest of the white matter. So in reality, it should look more gray, and these white matter hyperintensities signify that something is wrong. These are typically vascular lesions in the brain, although if you have multiple sclerosis, they actually mean something a little bit different. But if you have vascular disease, or if you're an older individual who might otherwise be healthy, typically white matter hyperintensities signal some type of vascular issue. And people with white matter hyperintensities are actually at a greater risk for Alzheimer's disease. So the question that is crucial that some of the researchers that I work with are trying to answer is, can Alzheimer's disease cause white matter hyperintensities, or are they purely vascular? So are white matter hyperintensities only caused by vascular disease, or can Alzheimer's disease actually cause a different type of white matter hyperintensity in a different area of the brain than what we would typically see with vascular disease? So before I talk a little bit more about that question, I want to loop back to talking about vascular dementia. So if you have white matter hyperintensities, and you're having some type of cognitive impairment, you may be diagnosed with vascular dementia. And one of the reasons that I'm talking about this is, even though it doesn't tie super nicely in with the rest of the things I'm talking about, I think it's really important that people understand that it is another type of dementia, and it's something that is likely more widespread than what most neurologists would like to think. So vascular dementia is dementia as a result of vascular disease. And it causes about 10 to 20% of the dementia cases. So it's actually the second leading cause of dementia after Alzheimer's disease. But misdiagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, if you in fact have vascular dementia, can actually cost up to $9,500 to $14,000 a year, because you're going to neurologist visits for visits that you don't need. You are potentially delaying the health interventions that you could have, which could lead to more costs in the future. You also may be taking medication for Alzheimer's disease that won't actually help you if you have vascular dementia. And it's also characterized by generalized cognitive decline. So individuals with vascular dementia, remember we talked about Alzheimer's disease is associated with what type of impairment? You can just put it in the chat. Maybe you'll remember what type of impairment it is associated with. So Alzheimer's disease is associated with memory impairment. Vascular dementia is associated with more generalized cognitive decline. So think of like yourself as a normally functioning person, and just maybe like 3 or 4 steps down, that might reach the clinical threshold of vascular dementia, rather than like a specific area of your life, such as your memory, would be affected. It can be associated with mood symptoms such as depression, which might, some people think that this might actually be leading to some of the late onset or late life depression that we are seeing more often. And it's characterized by the white matter hyperintensities that I showed you earlier, or these vascular lesions in the brain. So how do we tie all these things together? So we've talked about race, we've talked about disparities. Just get some water. We've talked about Alzheimer's disease. How do all of these things actually fit together? So I asked that question earlier. Can Alzheimer's disease cause these white matter hyperintensities, or are they purely vascular? And here's some of the reasons that we actually don't know. One of the reasons is recruitment convenience. So when scientists do their research, oftentimes they're recruiting people that they see in their clinic, they're recruiting people at the universities that they work at, and they're not actually reaching out into the community members. So they're not actually reaching out to people who are twice as likely to develop the disease or are more likely to have vascular disease. And so that can be that can bias your results towards whoever was convenient for you to recruit. And then the second piece, which I think is really important, is exclusion criteria. So this is just a fancy scientific term, which just basically means who can't participate. So for example, if you are studying individuals with Parkinson's disease, maybe you want to have an exclusion criteria of anyone that's had a traumatic brain injury can't participate in your study. So exclusion criteria for many Alzheimer's disease studies are actually vascular disease. So you wouldn't be able to participate in a study of Alzheimer's disease if you have vascular disease. The problem with that is that if vascular disease is more prevalent in a particular population, such as African Americans, and vascular disease is related to Alzheimer's disease, having an exclusion criteria or saying, oh, you can't participate in this study if you have vascular disease, is really going to bias your results towards people that may not have that vascular component, and so we can't understand those relationships. If you're excluding those people from your study, you're really limiting the generalizability and the applicability of your results to the wider population, which I think is one of the reasons that we don't have a lot of great treatment for Alzheimer's disease, because we really don't understand it. And then there's also the diversity in sampling. So it's African Americans are widely underrepresented in studies of Alzheimer's disease, which kind of doesn't make sense if they're twice as likely to actually develop the disease. So there's been a big push in the scientific community to try to require participation of individuals, or require recruitment strategies that specifically target the individuals who are more likely to actually develop your disease, which I think is a positive movement forward. But like I was saying, until we have that increased recruitment, we can't understand a lot of these more complex relationships. Okay, so what can we actually learn from studying race? If we prioritized race and we prioritized ethnocultural identity, what could we actually learn? So we could learn more about genetic risk factors. I'm not going to go into ApoE4 in great depth, but basically there are particular genetic risk factors such as ApoE4 that may have a different genetic risk depending on your other ancestry and lifestyle profiles. And so learning more about the utility of ApoE4 as an actual risk factor for Alzheimer's disease is very important, and we can learn more about this if we recruit a more diverse population. We could also learn about the real role of these inflammatory conditions such as type 2 diabetes and vascular disease by recruiting a larger population who also are more likely to have these diseases. And so if we want to really be able to understand the relationship between these inflammatory conditions, we have to make sure that we recruit participants that actually have a wide variety of experiences with these particular conditions. And then there's the education question. There's a kind of this underlying theme in a lot of dementia research that if you have a good education, you can kind of mitigate some of these cognitive effects that we're seeing with Alzheimer's disease, but we don't really know the answer to that. Is it the length of education? Is it the quality of education? And if we don't sample from people that have a diversity of experience with different education levels, we will not be able to answer this question. And race is highly entangled with education quality, at least in the United States. And then, as I alluded to earlier, there is this question of longer lifespan. So there's evidence within the African American communities that they have greater levels of community support, greater family support. So if we can understand what a particular ethnocultural group is getting right about this treatment of disease once you have it, we can then extrapolate some of those kind of proper care techniques onto the rest of the individuals that are affected by this disease and learn from one another to kind of enhance our experiences and understanding. And then the last piece is Alzheimer's disease actually vascular dementia? So one thing that we have talked about is this misdiagnosis. And if African Americans don't necessarily fit this profile of Alzheimer's disease, I think it's appropriate to also say, well, is it just that they're conveniently getting diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, or are there more African Americans that actually may have vascular dementia, but we're just not catching it because our tools aren't sensitive enough to view these complex questions with nuance? Okay, so how can you get involved? So I've told you all these things about how we need to increase participant recruitment, increase diversity in our sampling. So how can you actually help? Well, if you would like to participate in science, you can. Science is not this thing that's over here. We actually rely on people to come in and show up in our lab. And to participate in our studies and encourage their friends and family to participate in their studies. So I've included these links in an email that's going to be sent around, but there are ways that you can actually go and volunteer for studies, and you can put in your family history, you can put in as much information as you want, and then they will actually match you with studies that fit what you are interested in participating in. And I think this is something that people don't really realize, that you can actually participate in research. You don't actually just have to be sick. You don't have to have a disease. You being proactive about participating in research is something that anyone can really do, because we also need, there are also many studies that are interested in healthy aging. So what are you getting right about aging? There are studies that are interested in child development. And you don't just have to have a particular condition in order to participate in science. We're interested in you no matter who you are, because science is for the whole population, and that means you. So I encourage you to look not only at these particular websites, but also at your doctor's office, because often they post study flyers at doctor's office. And also I've noticed MARTA stations and like bus stations have advertisements for how to participate in particular types of research. So I'd like to I'm going to give a brief overview real quick. So we talked about the fact that Alzheimer's disease is 2 times more prevalent in African Americans, and that African Americans exhibit a unique profile of Alzheimer's disease, including cognitive differences, tau differences, and that our neuroimaging methods don't necessarily show a consensus among races. And so if we want to develop diagnostic tools, and if we want to develop statistical models using these neuroimaging methods, we have to make sure that they are generalizable to the whole population. And vascular disease plays a role in dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And that understanding this question can really only understanding of this question can really only be found by recruiting a diverse group of people that have particular genetic and biological and lifestyle markers that can help us understand these relationships. And that you can participate and encourage your community members to get involved in science. We need your data. And I think sometimes people are afraid because they're afraid that their data is going to be shared, like with many scandals that we've seen. But in reality, scientists have to go through really, really strict data collection and data privacy policies. And so you have rights to your data once it's collected. And so you can have some kind of, as a participant, can have control about what is and isn't shared. And that's a really important piece because I know that's kind of something that keeps people from participating. So I just want to talk really briefly about my affiliation. So I'm affiliated, as Lewis mentioned, with the Trend Center, and this is a neuroimaging and data science research facility that's associated with Georgia State, Georgia Tech, and Emory. And it's a fairly new center, and part of my job is to kind of get the word out about the research that we do. So we do research in dementia and healthy aging and bipolar disorder, psychosis, substance use disorders, depression, normal development. So we're interested in healthy individuals as well, and also a variety of child development disorders such as Alzheimer's or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So we use neuroimaging and big data to help answer some of these more complex questions associated with health as well as disease. And if you're interested in subscribing to our newsletter, you can go to trendcenter.org, and we will send periodic updates about some of the cutting edge research that we're doing. So with that, I just want to say thank you, and I will open it up for questions.